Today at the National Press Club, the polls suggest Australia's headed for a minority government, but these regional independent MPs hold the balance of power. Today at the National Press Club, it's regional independents Helen Haines and Bob Katter.
Welcome to the National Press Club of Australia on Ngunnawal country for today's Westpac event. I'm Gabrielle Chan, a Guardian Australia columnist and President of the National Rural Press Club. We are pleased to welcome today Dr Helen Haines, MP for Indi, who made history when she was voted into the Victorian seat following another independent, Cathy McGowan. She left her career as a nurse, wife, academic for Parliament in 2019. A group in Indi spawned the Voices for Community Independent model, which has spread like wildfire since 2013. We are also pleased to welcome Bob Katter, long-time state and federal MP, who just marked 50 years in public office. Bob began his career as member of the National Party, but in 2001, he quit the party and joined the crossbench, citing issues including Telstra, roads, petrol prices and competition reform. With typical cut-through at the time, Bob said of the Howard government, it was as popular in Queensland as a brown snake in a sleeping bag. You can join our conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @PressClubAust. Our hashtag is NPC. So I want to start, I've given everyone a statement actually taken from this month's quarterly essay, The Minority Report, written by George Megalogenis, and he posits that the protest vote in the UK created Brexit and the protest vote in the US created Trump. But an Australian protest vote created a new independent, largely female centre. And he further suggests the Australian result was aimed at forcing change on the system rather than disrupting it. So as a rural independent, do you feel you're here to keep the bastards honest or to change the system? Bob, do you want to start with that?
In my case, very much change the system. The system has destroyed manufacturing in Australia. 62% of motor cars in the 90s were Holdens, made in Australia, or other cars made in Australia. All of our fuel, 93%, was made in Australia. Now virtually no fuel is made in Australia. But in rural Australia, the biggest export earning item in 1990 was wool, 6,000 million, bigger than coal. Now how or why you would go out and completely destroy that industry. I had 3.5 million sheep in the state electorate I represented. I doubt whether there's 100,000 there now. There are negligible sheep in Australia. The whole industry was completely destroyed. And they didn't go to cattle. So there's nothing happening out there at all. What, are you going to continue with an empty country, are you? Well, you want to read some history books about empty country, starting with Mein Kampf of Adolf Hitler's. Yeah.
Helen?
Well, I think George's essay was a fantastic read. Read it over the summer, Gabby, and I think he's absolutely right. Australia has produced a community independent movement which is completely different to what we've seen anywhere else in the world, and most spectacularly different to what has transpired in the United States with the re-emergence of Mr Trump. I reckon from my perspective, I am both. I want to keep the bastards honest. I came into Parliament on a very strong platform of integrity, accountability, transparency in government, picked up the reins which Cathy had jumped on the horse of establishing a Federal Integrity Commission. I continued with that and pursued that vigorously because I could see that there was no accountability when people did the wrong thing. We have subsequently legislated a National Anti-Corruption Commission. The impact of the independence in making that happen cannot be denied, and I think it was one of the significant features that brought about the downfall of the Morrison government, quite frankly. He's intransigent to doing anything about that. So that's part of the integrity piece, which I think when we think about keeping the bastards honest, it is about changing the system to do so. The National Anti-Corruption Commission is one piece, but there's a whole lot of reform in the integrity space that we need to do. We need to stop the jobs for mates in statutory appointed bodies. We need to have truth in political advertising. We need to have decent, fair electoral reform, and we'll probably talk a bit about that later. So I think it's two things. And I guess the other thing I would say about this is it's interesting when you think about disruption. And for many of us, when we came to Parliament, the disrupting force of particularly a large group of women coming onto the crossbench was to disrupt the appalling behaviour, the misogynism, the awful behaviour that was detailed breathtakingly in the Jenkins Review. So if that's disruption, if that's a protest vote, it's a different kind of protest vote to what we saw, well, what we're seeing in the United States.
Bob, how different is it being an independent to being part of a major party and in government? Because you've done both. You're a minister in the state Queensland government and obviously you were part of the Howard government. How different is it? Because the criticism is always that you can't get anything done.
I thought when I got out that was true. I represented 16 major agricultural industries, and each of them was destroyed by my own party. And I have a very deep hatred for those people. And I'm entitled to my hatred, because I had to watch, in the dairy industry, the highest suicide rate in Australia was between Malanda and Atherton. Guess where the most intense dairy area in Australia was? Between Atherton and Malanda. And I knew those people. They're friends of mine, those people. And you just did it and you couldn't care less. You just did it and you couldn't care less. Well, I was in a position to destroy some of those people that did it to us. And I make no apologies for that. So, you know, but the thing that amazed me was that I couldn't get meetings with ministers in my own party. You know, they were busy and, you know, I'm nobody and they're somebody and, you know, they couldn't fit me in. But, oh, Bobby, I'll see you 2 weeks' time. I've got to go and fit you in, mate. Yeah, you know. And but when I became an independent, oh, yeah, right, just come right over. Because they were scared of me attacking them. And I found out that I had immensely more power than I'd ever had or ever could dream of having. And even as a minister in the state government, you know, I was exercising relatively more power than even as a very powerful and, you know, some people said brutal minister. But I didn't exercise anywhere near as much power as I've been exercising since I got out of the system. And fear is a very powerful weapon in a parliament.
Helen, tell us about your day-to-day dealing, particularly when Parliament's sitting. Do you meet with the government regularly? Do you meet with the opposition? How much access do you get?
Well, unlike Bob, I've never been in a major party, so I've only ever been an independent. And
lucky you, Helen.
Yeah, I know, Bob. I would never join a major party. I couldn't imagine joining a major party. So almost 6 years now in the Parliament. I hope I get to 6 years, depending when the election is, of course. But working with a Liberal government and now working with a Labor government, I have as much access to ministers as I want, and I can't remember what the number is. We count these things and put it out on our newsletters so my constituents know. But, you know, I think over maybe 200 meetings with ministers over that period of time. And when I go to a minister, I go to describe an issue that we may be experiencing in the electorate, but I'm always going with a solution that the people of Indi have come to me with, or that I've worked with civil society experts, done deep research about, and put a proposition to a minister. So I would say excellent access, and you know, I would thank both governments that I've worked for having an open door to me as an independent. But one of the things that's been really good with this government is we've been getting every week when Parliament sits detailed legislative briefings from the ministers. So the crossbench all line up, and one by one in come the ministers who are introducing legislation that week. And they give us their pitch, and we ask them questions about, what's the purpose of this? What's the problem you're trying to solve? That doesn't look like good governance to me. Please explain. And again, they leave that meeting knowing where perhaps we have some sensitive issues to continue, and we can go back to them on that. And I think that's been a really great change with this government. So plenty of access to ministers.
Bob, is that a big change from the minority government under Julia Gillard? Did you have regular meetings through that time? Because you famously walked away from the deal that Windsor and Oakeshott, Tony Windsor and Robert Oakeshott did. So was the access the same?
These things are always warped by personal relationships, I suppose. And I know Kevin Rudd and I share a very strong Christian belief, and we're the only two non-Liberals that just go on Christian group. And I got friendly with Kevin, but also I was running the show in Queensland before the government fell. Mind you, a lot of nasty people said that's why it fell, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. But he came in after me, and he was running Queensland. I mean, there was a Premier, but the Premier just gave Kevin complete control. And I said to him, I said, you didn't do a good job, Kevin, but you didn't do a bad job either. I mean, and that was pretty good. In the light of the governments that we've had in Queensland over the last 30 years, it was one of the better governments, and that was because Kevin was there. So I had great respect for him. And, you say, well, what power do you have? Well, I changed the Prime Minister of Australia, and I knew that I could, and I called a press conference at 10:30 in this morning, and I was committing political harry-carry because I looked like a switcher and twicer and, rainbow dancer, switching sides all the time. I only scraped through that election by 52%. But 10:30 I called a press conference and said I'd switched my allegiance. 10:30 that night, Julia was gone. And I don't like saying that because I like Julia personally and had great respect for her. But all the same, the cattle market was closed into Indonesia. It was never going to be open while she was there. Well, Julia, you chose the decision. You chose it, not me. So I'm left no alternative now. And the immense power that you wielded on the crossbench, I could never conceive of that when I got out. I just thought I was walking into my early death. No one had ever got re-elected in the history of Australia. No one had ever they got elected as independent, never re-elected until Peter Andren and the Mayor of Sydney got re-elected that election. But now, Helen, we always get re-elected.
Bob, Cabby, can I just comment on what Bob just said then? Because I think the critical bit, and I'm really interested, I always love hearing Bob Katter's stories, right? Like, Bob Katter is an amazing historian, and I learned heaps from Bob. In fact, he very, very generously, when I first came to Parliament, he invited me to come and have dinner with him, and I said, you got any advice for a new player, Bob? He said to me, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, no, because it's nothing that really, I know it's Valentine's Day, but this is okay. Bob said, Helen, be optimistic and smile a lot. People hate to see a miserable politician. And I think it's actually great advice, but part of it is about how you approach your constituents. And the bit that Bob just shared with us then is that he changed his allegiance because of the need of his constituents to do so. The cattle trade, that was critical to the people of Kennedy, and you heard their voice and you represented them and you changed your allegiance. And I think that's what independents do. I mean, we don't have to kowtow to a party boss. We represent the people of our electorate. That's our number one thing. And I think that's why you've been elected and re-elected so many times, Bob.
But how much do you caucus as independents? Because even though you're independents, the crossbench has a lot of toing and froing between the offices on things like legislation. Is there a regular caucusing of independents?
Yeah, so what we do and what we agreed to do, well, not a formal agreement, but what we talked about when the crossbench expanded so dramatically in the 2022 election was it would be useful to all of us if we knew what each other was doing in terms of amending legislation, for example. And that's something that we do a lot on the crossbench. I mean, it relates to that question about do we have access to ministers? Yes, we do. And one of the things that we negotiate with ministers is we have a piece of legislation in front of us and we interrogate it very, very forensically and find opportunities to improve it, find opportunities that are meaningful for our electorate. So it'd be kind of crazy if every independent was trying to get the same amendment. So we had come together once a week when Parliament sits and we talk about what's the forthcoming legislation, has anyone got any amendments, has anyone got any events coming up that they're sponsoring. We try to get crowds into those. Bob's part of that meeting. In fact, Bob, I remember you said, Helen, are you going to be the boss of this meeting because I'll come if you are? And I said, no, Bob, it'll be the feminist model. We'll have a rotating chair. And Bob's there.
Are you the chief feminist?
I can't have a comment. You know, she said a lot of women now, you know. But Andrew Wilkie, who sits beside me in the Parliament, he keeps yelling out, equal opportunity, equal opportunity.
I just want to talk about rural policy issues now. And I guess the last 20 years, really, identity politics has really taken off. And we often think about identity politics in terms of race or sexuality or lots of other different groupings. But rural Australia is an identity in itself, I think. And I just want to mention some work done by Rebecca Colvin and Frank Yotzo at the ANU. And they were surveying people across the country looking for differences on policy issues around things like climate change, social issues, Australian values. And what they found was the only real divide between city and country is that country people, and we're talking inner and outer regional areas, see themselves as different, see their attitudes as different to their city counterparts. So is it possible even to think of country people as having completely different attitudes to city people on key voting issues?
Well, again, I acknowledge Rebecca's work and really grateful for it, actually. This kind of research is super helpful. I, again, came to Parliament promising the people of Indi that I would take a principled, evidence-based approach to policy. So I'm really reliant on the research community for providing that kind of evidence. I think that rural and regional Australians, and it was demonstrated by this research, do see themselves as differently, but there are many issues that we have in common with our city cousins. And I think most recently some research that was published showing attitudes to climate change. Now, there's a bit of a trope going around that rural and regional Australians don't believe in climate change or don't care about climate change, and in fact that was shown to be completely untrue. Rural and regional Australians are at the forefront of climate change. We've seen our farmers making significant business decisions about what crops they plant, how they use water, how they think about biosecurity, very, very conscious of climate change, not to mention, of course, the catastrophic impacts of more frequent, more intense bushfires and flooding. So rural and regional Australians, I think, have much in common with city people who I know worry about rural and regional Australia and the impact of climate change. But I think it is true to say that in the bush, and Bob and I have both spent most of our lives there, really. I'm a country kid, grew up on a dairy farm. We know that there are some things that have never changed for rural and regional Australia, and number one of those is our health outcomes. I mean, I spent 30 years in healthcare before I became an MP, and it distresses me that all those years in healthcare, and now that I'm in the Parliament, that we haven't shifted the dial. Rural and regional Australians still die younger, they suffer from more chronic diseases, they have the same prevalence of mental illness, but they have a higher suicide rate. And it comes down to one thing, and that's investment and access to healthcare. I mean, we have a Medicare system, but rural and regional Australians don't get to use it to the extent that their city cousins do. They're the things that make us different.
So it's a resource-based issue.
Yes, it is.
Bob, what do you think?
No, the electorate I represent, you know, we diametrically opposed to climate change. Let there be no equivocation here. If I was to start talking about climate change, I could forget about being re-elected. The Labor Party is seen as a climate change party. They hold 2 out of, I think, 30 seats in North Queensland now. They've been annihilated. The people that I represent, you say they're farmers. No, they're not. I don't have many farmers in the Kennedy electorate at all. But the farmers I do have, you know, I have sugar harvester, cane harvester drivers. I have, you know, people that put fertiliser on the ground. But there's probably 10 people for every farmer in the cane industry. And in the cattle industry, well, you know, my station property is 250,000 acres. We don't have a lot of cattle people when you've got stations of that size. So I don't have a lot of farmers. But the farming families have their kids working in the mines. So I very much represent, and you know, people wonder sometimes about my union affiliation, but you know, well, I represent those people. I worked in the mines myself as a young bloke, as most North Queenslanders do. But no, I represent the steel boot mob, you know, the steel cap boots. Yeah, a lot of them will go back on the farm or buy the farm next to Daddy's or have a mob of cattle and, you know, buy a bit of country. So, you know, there's definite country element there, but really, you know, I represent the industrial heartland, the mining industry, very, very much.
I'll just ask one more question and then I'll ask for questions from the floor. So does that mean it's impossible to represent the 30% of Australia that lives in rural and regional and remote areas as one voice or having one set of policy issues?
Look, I don't think that you can treat this vast nation as an homogenous group no matter what. I mean, even within an electorate, my electorate is much smaller than Bob's. Mine's only 29,000 square kilometres. There are multiple communities within that electorate and they have different views. So I think that there are some commonalities, and I mentioned one of them. Bob and I are absolutely on a unity ticket about healthcare, I reckon, Bob. Yeah, we have different views about the science of climate change, but I think we both, I mean, you're going through up there catastrophic flooding right now. We would both agree that there's been absolutely woefully inadequate investment into resilience and mitigation for flooding, for bushfires, for natural disasters in rural and regional Australia. But I think to Bob's point, like, I think there is this notion of rural and regional Australia that it is all about farmers, but similar to Bob, agriculture is around 10% of the economy in Indi. Health and social services is the biggest part. And to Bob's point too, for the agricultural community, it's the services that service them. So when we think about rural and regional Australia, we're thinking about many, many people from all sorts of backgrounds, and indeed there's been a big net migration out of the cities into rural and regional Australia post-COVID, so there's a new generation of people coming through. And for the first time, and this is so exciting, we're seeing younger people, young families wanting to come and live in the regions. And I mean, the biggest handbrake on that, of course, is we have a housing crisis. We can't house them. So yeah, I think we have a diverse constituency, a diverse population, and we have to listen. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to, is getting out there and listening to a broad range of views. One of the joys of being an MP is being out on the high streets, and I get out in my little caravan into tiny towns. You're at footy matches, all sorts of places. You try to go into the local supermarket to buy a loaf of bread. You won't get out in under an hour. Because people want to tell you things, and a good MP listens and brings that to the Parliament. And there is a range of views. And again, I would say, what is representation? It's not being a delegate. It's about trying to bring all those views together, make sense of them, and make the best decision you possibly can with the policies that are in front of you, but also to bring fresh policies to a government and say, consider this.
Okay.
Should have been Premier of Queensland, a bloke called Neil Turner, a real character. And my best friend there in the state parliament, I suppose. But Neil used to say, all I've got to do is keep 12 people happy. That's my local electoral council, because they all vote, you know, country party as we then were. I had to keep 12 people happy. In the party system, yeah, that's all you've got to do. It's grovel and keep tall people happy. But, you know, I watch my state members that are in the party that I'm in, and no, they got to keep 30,000 people happy. You know, they can't rely upon, you know, a little clique of supporters. So Helen's point is very, very prescient. You know, you can say our failure to get movement on the health issue. Well, Helen may not share my view, but, you know, you ask nicely and you ask intelligently, and then you destroy. And unless they know that you're going to destroy them, I just find you can't get an example. I constantly quote the Meena Creek pub, you know, which is, they say my office is, he's down the office, you know. What do you mean he's down the office? He's not here. We're in the office now. No, his office is the Meena Creek pub or the Garradunga pub, you know. But Tommy in the Meena Creek pub, hey, Bobby, who's driving the bus? Now, I want to know who's driving the bus. And I said, Tommy, I'll take that on, you know, I'll think about that. So about 20 minutes later, I said, hey, Tommy, the answer to your question is who's driving the bus is nobody is driving the bus. You know?
Okay.
And I mean, and that's our problem with getting, for example, healthcare, you know, into rural towns and places. We got the breakthrough with the first medical school built in Australia in 44 years. The medical schools, they thought they wanted to keep their prestige. Well, we're dying because there's no doctors. They were keeping up their prestige.
Well, we have to get to our first question. Sorry to interrupt.
Thanks.
Cass Sullivan from the ABC.
Thank you, Gabby, and thanks to both of our panellists today. It's been reported that the Prime Minister hosted a function with some independents at the Lodge this week, and you talked a lot about access to the government. But I noticed in a lot of the reporting, the headline said it was the Teals that had been invited, or it was the Teals that had dined out. I wonder, have you ever been confused for a Teal, and how would that make you feel?
I would never be confused. I'm the wrong gender for starters.
Oh, yeah. Kath,
you can.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Look, Kath, I think everybody loves talking about this collective noun called the Teal. It's shorthand. I think it's an invention of the media to try and describe what happened in 2022 when so many women mainly from entirely actually from Sydney and Melbourne and Perth, of course, member for Curtin, were elected to the crossbench. So it's shorthand for that group of women, fantastic representatives of their communities. They hold different views on a whole lot of things and a whole lot of views in common. And I think, you know, the press often reports about that being integrity, which I spoke to before, climate and gender equity, women's issues. Have I been accused? Accused, I think was the word you used, was it? Or
Confused.
Confused. I don't know that it's confusion when people like to call me a Teal. I think it's very deliberate because there's been, from the major parties, a weaponisation of that term. And any women in the audience today who find themselves being successful in their career and exercising the power that comes with office will be familiar with the many ways that the system attempts to undermine their authority. And I think Teal is part of that attempt.
Just on that, if you were to bandy together and form a party, perhaps you'd have greater funding for your political campaigns. You'd be able to spend a bit more.
Well, I mean, do you want me to expand on this?
That's a bit of a Dixer for you.
Yeah, it is a Dixer.
No, I'd like to comment upon that. In the state elections, we were touted to win 4 seats, and we expected to win 4 seats. We lost one. Instead of winning 4, we lost one. The Liberal Party spent $2.3 million in 6 North Queensland seats, saying ad nauseam that a vote for us was a vote for Labor. And our how to vote cards, for the first time ever, I was opposed to this. They're usually alternative, you know. But this time, no, we had an how to vote card that says gave preference to the Liberals. So what the Liberals were saying were a flagrant lie. They spent $2.3 million selling the lie we had $90,000 to answer the lie, and instead of winning 4 seats, we lost 1. Well, congratulations. Lying pays dividends.
Kath, can I answer that question? Because everyone, I think, here probably follows the news, and this week the government passed a bill which they nominally called electoral reform, and this was a bill that I was really looking forward to entering the parliament and having a fulsome debate, not only with the parliament, but having a discussion with my community about this, because as part of the integrity package that I talk about, electoral reform was there. I want to see greater transparency in political donations. I want to get the big money out of politics. I want to see real-time disclosure of political donations. But what we saw, in fact, was a little bit of that, an improvement and something that I welcome. But we saw a lot of other stuff too, which essentially tries to curb the disruption that the independent and minor parties have created. And to right back to that first question that Gabby asked us. So I think to your point about do we bandy together and form a party, well, that's kind of the nub of it, isn't it? That unless you are in a major party, you will not get the full advantage of this so-called electoral reform. So if you're an outsider, if you're an independent, then you're playing to a different set of rules. And I think the Australian public ought to be a real wake-up to this. The good news is, though, folks, for anyone listening along at home, is that this new Act of Parliament, which will become law soon once the Governor-General sees it, doesn't come into effect until after the next election. And again, drawing us back to what we've been talking about, if I'm privileged enough to be re-elected and my colleagues on the crossbench are re-elected and there's a whole new, and I really hope there are many, many more regional independents elected, what a marvellous first meeting with the Special Minister of State to talk about how we might amend that particular bill.
Simon Gross from Canberra IQ.
My question's to Bob, but Helen may want to comment. People have talked about your long parliamentary career, Bob, and 40 years ago you were a minister in Queensland and you were the Minister for Northern Development and Aboriginal and Islander Affairs. And I do recall a quote from Noel Pearson saying you were the best Queensland Minister for Aboriginal Affairs that Queensland ever had. So I want to put to you this coming election, this federal election, we're going to have a very stark choice when it comes to Indigenous affairs. The government will probably maintain what they're doing, but Jacinta Price has a very different approach. I just wanted to get your views on what Jacinta Price is proposing.
Look, I don't mean to be disrespectful to her, but really, I'm not interested. You know, every night of my life, I have to go to bed knowing that of all the people, 26 million people in Australia, the person best suited to get this fixed up is me, and I have failed. And I have failed miserably. Kevin Rudd, I said, please, you've got to address this. And he said, talk to the minister. I have 3 times. And the last time, she burst out crying because I just couldn't control my anger. The life expectancy of fair dinkum blackfellas, and they're relatives of mine, some of them. I come from Cloncurry. I'm dark. But there's a saying, you're Murray from the Curry. And I've always identified that way. And never felt funny about it. But my brother cousins, their life expectancy is 54. I mean, if you want to talk about Adolf Hitler and racism, I'd like people to explain to me how you can live with a life expectancy of 54 for our first Australians, and I know the answers, and I can't get the government to do it.
Okay, but you didn't talk about policy then, you just went on a cattle rant. That's probably part of your problem.
No, I don't have a problem, my friend. I have an ability to hurt people, and I don't hesitate to say that if they think that I'm going to sit there and watch my people with a life expectancy of 54, the answer lies in giving them the right to own land. Not tribal ownership. Tribes ceased to exist 200 years ago in this country. All it has done is put dreadful fighting inside every community in Queensland.
Okay.
And I'm concentrating on the real fair income blokes that live in the dormitories and Cowan-Yarmouths and Pumper House.
I wonder if Helen's got a view on the opposition.
You know, I'm just saying to you that they are not allowed to own land. And if you, I can refer you to the books. There is no doubt that if you can't own land, you can't borrow money. If you can't borrow money, you can't open a business. And they can't get work. My son talks about blue cards. Please give me 1 second more. Blue cards all the time. Because if you have a beer, that's illegal in the community areas. Every other Australian can drink, but they can't. Well, of course, they have a beer. They're just Australians like the rest of us. And when they do, they are not allowed to get a government job. So there's no commercial jobs in the communities. They can't get a government job. Well, is it surprising that we are where we are?
Okay.
And,
Helen?
yeah.
So, Simon, if you could just take me back to your question.
Well, the difference between the opposition's approach to Indigenous affairs and the government's approach, I wonder, what are your views?
Look, I've only heard what Senator Price has had to say on the news. I haven't seen any fully fleshed out policy in regard to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. When I do, the first thing I would do would be to come together with the traditional owners of the land where I represent and try to get a view from them about what they think about her ideas.
Thank you.
Okay. Peter Hobson from Reuters News.
Hi guys. Hi. I wanted to ask whether you consider renewable energy to be an economic opportunity for rural Australia.
I just have a sense of screaming frustration here. We got through 4.5% ethanol in Queensland, and other people, the Premier of New South Wales got through 6.5% ethanol, and IEMA said, when he introduced it, I will not go another day with people dying in Sydney that simply don't have to die. If you have no ethanol in the tank, you will die. A lot of people will die. And I haven't got time to elaborate on that. But that was why AMA did it, and he was dead right in doing it. The AMA constantly and continuously has come out for ethanol in the petrol tank. Now, you burn petrol, CO2 goes up and it stays up. You burn ethanol, CO2 goes up, and the cane or the grain pull it back down the next year. So it's just going up and down. I mean, there's a 6% benefit just by doing that one thing, the same as Brazil does. Just that one thing. So I think there's great benefits for rural Australia in this area. And, you know, even though I'm not a climate change man, but all the same, I mean, where CO2 is increasing at an increasing rate, way back I put the first standalone solar system in Australia. And I was conscious of the fact that increasing at an increasing rate, yeah, I think there should be a bit of a pullback here. But I'm no...
I might jump in now, Bob.
No, I'm not climate change people. But, you know, the most obvious thing to do is not being done. The most obvious thing to do, ethanol, is not being done.
Okay, Bob.
Bob did a really good briefing for us on the crossbench once about this, and I think it's an example of Bob comes with some really interesting ideas, and you've been a real champion for ethanol in particular. But the question was, is renewable energy an opportunity for regional Australia? Well, the answer is yes. It's a huge opportunity for regional Australia if we do it right. I think what we're struggling with right now is that we had a decade of denial around our need to decarbonise. We had a decade of no planning when it came to where renewables, whether they be grid-scale solar or wind, or indeed hydrogen or hydro, whatever it might be. We had no planning about where they would go. And critically, we did no education piece, we did no genuine consultation with rural and regional Australians about how this was all going to work and who would benefit. So a big focus of my term this Parliament has been working with the Energy Minister to draw his attention to this fact, that rural and regional Australians feel left behind in the transition to renewables. They're seeing massive landscape change a change to their visual amenity, which really means something to us in the bush, genuine concerns about what does grid-scale solar mean in terms of bushfire safety, what does grid-scale energy look like in terms of biosecurity risks, insurance, land values for adjoining properties. These are real and genuine concerns from real and genuine rural and regional Australians. The Energy Minister agreed when Senator Pocock and I came to him around this to say we've got real worries about this. There was a review into community engagement undertaken by Professor Andrew Dyer, who at the time was the Energy Infrastructure Commissioner. I really recommend, if you haven't read the Dyer review, please do. There were 9 recommendations from that. I got Professor Dyer down to my patch in Indi. We did roundtables. I put in a fulsome submission. And I think that if the government, whoever is re-elected, I'll be really holding them to account on this. I'm very pleased that the former CEO of the NFF is the new Energy Infrastructure Commissioner. I've already met with him in his new role, and I'm really committed to doing this right and doing it well, because if we get the community benefit angle of this right, if we get them in the right places, number one, if we get rid of the cowboys who stir up fear in communities by out there prospecting and then flipping a deal, and then we finally get someone who's going to build a project, and it's not until there's a planning submission about to hit that the neighbours are notified, this is no good. We've got to get it right, and we have to do a whole lot better than a large multinational company throwing $75,000 in a community benefit fund to the local footy club. We need our rural councils, our leaders in rural communities getting in there on the front foot and saying, okay, we're in a renewable energy zone, this is what it means to us, this is what we want out of it. And we don't want to be, we're not selling our souls for social licence here. We need to be negotiating for long-term, sustainable, fabulous regional development. We've talked about healthcare. We need to ensure that in this renewable energy transformation, and it is happening at speed, we need to get it right, and we need to see hospitals built, we need to see better roads built, we need to see early education and care centres so the doctors who want to come and work in our towns have got somewhere for their kids to be. This is a massive opportunity, and I'm absolutely determined to hold whoever holds power really accountable for getting this right for us in the bush.
Thanks.
Brazil has 49% ethanol in their petrol tanks. The price of petrol is $1.09. And they have the 2 cleanest cities in the world. Both those cities have a big population than Australia. They're over 26 million.
Bob, we need to get on to the next question from Melissa Code, the Mandarin.
Hi, both. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. Where there's politics, there's always conflict, and democracy doesn't always mean consensus. So given Helen, what you spoke about in terms of listening to the community, and Bob, you talked about representing a large steel-capped boot constituency, what's your advice to future political leaders? There is so much cynicism and sense of disenfranchisement when it comes to Australian democracy, and conversations about city versus regional is always sort of couched in us and them terms. How do we solve that?
Maybe I'll start, Melissa. I try to bring my whole life experience to the Parliament. I'm not someone who grew up in the party. I'm not someone who was ever an advisor to an MP. I came into the Parliament really not knowing how the politics bit worked, but I certainly have got lots of experience in bringing people together on things that they have different views on. And I think the critical part is trying to find the value system that we do agree on. And I think there is a keen set of values in Australia that rural and regional Australians and metropolitan Australians want to see a fair go for everyone. I've got plenty of relatives who live in the city, and they're really shocked and appalled when they know that we can't access specialist care. They're shocked and appalled when they know that a young person in a country town has got a much higher likelihood of dying by suicide than a city kid. They don't want to see that either. So I think there is a coalition of desire to do better, and I think that's always a starting point. For me, it's always about having, I guess, a clear understanding of what the problem is and what the suite or the menu of solutions might be, what the policy solutions might be. And it's in that solution bit that often the tension is there, and the tension is good. I mean, the tension is great. If you've got to try and justify an answer to a problem or argue the case for a particular policy lever to be pulled or a budget line to be created in order to solve a problem, then you need to know your stuff, and you need to be able to convince others that that's the right way to go. I mean, that's what the Parliament should be about.
Your message, Helen, to the next leaders?
Is to actually listen a whole lot more to the debate in the House. And again, that's why I was furious yesterday on the electoral reform debate. It was guillotined in the Senate and gagged in the House of Representatives. So there was no listening, there was no debate. Debate is where our democracy flourishes. So we need to listen a whole lot more and listen to people that we think we may not agree with and try to find a way forward. And you won't always get what you want, right? But it always starts with listening and having an open mind to an alternative view.
And Bob, will we paraphrase your approach to ask nicely and then destroy? Your message?
You sort of, Helen's saying, we can work, the city people and country people are really not all that different. I come from North Queensland, and, I mean, I can't use any other word except hatred for Brisbane. But we had 500,000 people trapped between 5,000-foot high mountains and 30 kilometres away, the sea. And they were trapped in that trap, 500,000 people for nearly 2 weeks. Now, if a cyclone had come in, there would have been massive loss of life, right? We want 1 kilometre of tunnel. That's all we want. And that wouldn't have arisen with 1 kilometre of tunnel. Brisbane has 36 kilometres of tunnels. That is $36,000 million. We got nothing. Our population is 1 million. Theirs is 1.2 million. But centre of gravity is in South East Queensland. Brisbane dominates South East Queensland. So we get nothing. De Tocqueville, the great commentator upon which most democracies, their constitution was written, his last book was The Tyranny of the Majority. And North Queensland would be a classic example of the tyranny of the majority. We got 42 million for a cassowary walkover with an 80-foot drop on the other side. No one told them cassowaries don't have wings.
So, Bob, do you...
What's your message?
But we can't
What's
get
your message?
a 1 kilometre tunnel. That, there must be a diversification of representation. And quite frankly, as far as I'm concerned, I want to be as far away from Brisbane as is humanly possible to get.
Bob, do you think our political paradigm has room for or space for Australia we can all believe in? Or is it just inherently conflicted in the way you describe it?
I think that is a very relevant question. And I have been in parts of Sydney and Melbourne, and they hate Australians. There's no doubt in my mind that they hate Australians. I had a confrontation, a very unpleasant confrontation, at the Melbourne airport recently. But they hate Australians. But, about 40, like in America, they went after the wokies. And like about 60%, I think, of America hates the wokies. In Australia, no, it's the other way around. I think they're immensely more powerful in Australia.
Is woke just a term for the others, whoever the others are?
In my opinion, yes. That's the term I use to describe the others. But, they're not people that start rubbing their eyes, on Anzac Day. They're not those sort of people. In fact, they don't even turn up at Anzac Day.
Okay, Bob. Thank you. Next question is Brett Worthington from the ABC.
Hello, thanks for coming along today. I'd be curious to get your sense on if it is a minority government, if you'd be willing to offer confidence and supply to either side without necessarily saying who, and the values and principles that you would look to follow in determining which side you would allow confidence and supply.
I would like you to say who as well.
Well, thanks for the question, Brett. And I think what's really important to understand here is that the collective theatre of a minority government tends to hinge upon this notion of somebody or some people making somebody, being a kingmaker or a queenmaker, if only. But it's not necessarily about that at all. And I think that what we know about our democracy and our parliament and our constitution is if there is not a clear result come election night or the days after, the Prime Minister and the government remain the government until such a time that somebody else can show that they have the numbers. So there's that, which gives us stability, of course, to our governance. And right now we need that kind of stability. We've got all sorts of interesting comments coming across from the United States, which means we need to have a government functioning. So that remains. So I want to reassure Australia that should this scenario unfold, that Australia can be governed. I think the next question around that is, how do we then ensure that we have a functioning, stable parliament? And does that mean that someone or some people need to give assurance to the Prime Minister, the sitting Prime Minister, or indeed the opposition leader, so that they can form government? That may well be the case. The Prime Minister could somehow glean that he has that supply, he has that confidence and supply from the crossbench. The opposition leader possibly could too. They can come to the House and they can ask the House to decide. That can happen under our constitution. We have to elect a speaker, of course, and then that vote can happen on the floor. I tell you what I won't do. I will never sign a deal that signs away my vote on every piece of legislation. I would never do that, because when you think about this disruptive power thing that we've been talking about, the greatest capacity to negotiate and improve legislation and get better outcomes for the people I represent, and I believe the whole nation, is to be able to negotiate right throughout the next parliament and not to sign away that. That would be completely stupid, I reckon.
Thanks,
so I won't be doing that.
Bob?
You know, I think you've got to understand how bad it is for us. I represent the Australian cane industry, a third of it, you know, there is no doubt that both parties have agreed that there can be no runoff onto the barrier reef. Well, that runoff has been there for 200 years. And to quote the great guru, he said, "It is the most wonderful place on earth, the Great Barrier Reef, and it is as beautiful as it's ever been." Well, he's the great guru, you know, I'll quote him. But if you actually take away the runoff, then the dugong will die. They're living on seagrass that's been nutrition has been applied to it for 150 years anyway. So you know, you've got to be very careful when you move here. You want to know what you're doing. I mean, with crocodiles, for example, a female crocodile has 60 eggs. So if you remove its predators, which is mainly man, you removed the main predator, well, then you have an explosion in numbers and nature goes out of balance. There are fishes now that are not there because crocodiles have taken them. Once you start fooling around with nature, you've got a lot of bad stuff that can come down. And I'm not going to give the gong the power in Australia unless I get assurances that my industries are not going to be closed down.
Can I just say one more thing about that, Gabby? Because this is the question on everybody's lips.
Two more questions.
And anyone on the crossbench could decide, for the purposes of having stable government to get started, confidence and supply to one person or the other. And then at any time throughout the next parliament, a vote of no confidence can happen on the floor. So I think this business of a forever thing is not necessarily so. And what we want to see is stable governance, and what we want to see is really good legislation. And we saw in the Gillard government, arguably, some of the best negotiations, some bad ones too, but plenty of legislation going through and some significant reforms in a minority government.
Kath Sullivan.
Sorry, just back again quickly before. I know Morris has a question for you. Seeing as you didn't really answer Brett's question, I was just wondering if maybe you'd make a comment on the agricultural policies of the major parties, even the Greens and the Teals, how you see agriculture to fare under perhaps a coalition government or a Labor government, or whether you have concerns about the minor parties' agricultural policies.
Well, maybe I'll kick off. I think what we don't clearly see from either major party is a clear pathway and clear policy around agriculture. I think what I know to be true is that agriculture is one of our most successful export industries, And our capacity to feed ourselves and feed the world is because of modern agricultural science and the quality of our farmers. What I hear from my farmers holding them back is workforce and is housing and is critical enabling infrastructure to our regional communities. I don't see anything from the majors on how they're going to fix that element, so that intersection of all the other elements that allow agriculture to thrive.
Okay, Bob, quickly, because I know the next question you'll want to hear.
If you're comparing the rhetoric of both parties, the Liberals come a mile ahead of Labor on rhetoric. But if you look at performance, all I can say in North Queensland, it's the other way around. But, you know, for reasons I don't fully understand, the Labor Party has really antagonised country Australia. I've never seen sort of a differentiation that I'm seeing now. So it's a very good question that you asked.
Okay. Morris.
Thanks, Gab. I've got a couple of questions here from the Batuta Advocate. I am hoping one day the NT News turns up here, but that's another story. There's a question for Bob and a question for Helen.
Johnny Clements was not responsible for tying the priest to the anthill.
From Clancy Overall, Overall, the editor of the Advocate. Dear Bob, I'm sorry to betray your trust by revealing the contents of a private conversation I had with you over a few tall glasses of rum and milk at Mount Isa's Barclay Hotel in 2017, but I believe you are the only man who knows the real story behind Waltzing Matilda. First, you suggested to me that Jolly Smagman was not in fact that jolly. You believed him to be an itinerant new Australian, likely from Finland and Germany, with no fixed address, no official form of unemployment. There were accusations that he's previously known to the Whitton police for reasons that have not been made public to the Australian people. Furthermore, you insinuated that since the Berry coronary report found out that Jolly's man suffered a gunshot before he diving into the Billabong on that fateful afternoon in 1895. Mr Katter, on behalf of the Australian, I'm asking, what else do you know about the circumstances of the Jolly Swagman's death? The people of Australia deserve answers.
I've always been very involved with trade unions, and my brothers know he was a scab.
Right. And then...
And the last question from Errol Parker, editor-at-large of the Batuta Advocate. We're going to have these guys here at some stage. Anyway, Helena, is Wodonga the Springfield of the Upper Murray and Albury the Shelbyville? Or is it the other way around? Take your time.
Oh. Well, you know, I think actually Wodonga is the Paris of the North. Oh, Victoria.
Please, Helen, please.
Right, and on that note, I'd like you to join us in thanking our guests, Helen Haines and Bob Katter.